Hi, how's it going, everyone? Atmosphere version 1.80 is now fully released, and this version supports firmware version 19.0. In this video, I'll be sharing a tutorial on how to update the custom firmware on your Switch. However, unlike my previous video, this time I'll include some preventive steps you can take before updating. This way, if anything goes wrong, you won't lose any important data on your Switch. Alright, without further ado, let's jump straight into the tutorial. The first step before updating the custom firmware is to back up important data. In my opinion, there are only two essential types of data on the Switch that need to be backed up: save games and the games themselves. First, we'll back up the save games. To do this, we'll use a homebrew application called JKSV. If JKSV is not installed on your Switch, you can download it from the HB App Store. Make sure your Switch is connected to the internet beforehand. Then, search for JKSV in the search menu or find it under the Tools section. Select it and download it. Once the installation is complete, you'll see the JKSV app icon appear. Next, we need to run the JKSV application in non-applet mode. To do this, return to the home screen first. To launch homebrew apps in non-applet mode, highlight any game, press and hold the R button, then run the game while still holding R button. Select any user, but keep holding R button. If successful, the homebrew menu will appear. From there, launch the JKSV application. Here's what the JKSV interface looks like. Next, select the user profile icon whose save games you want to back up. To back up all save games, press Y. If you only want to back up specific save games, select the profile icon, then choose the game you want to back up and select New Backup. In my case, I'll back up all save games, so I'll press B to go back, then press Y to dump all saves. Okay, the game backup process is complete. If you select the game, you can see that each one already has a save game backup file, labeled with the user profile name and the time the file was backed up. We'll later copy this save game backup to the computer, but for now, let's continue with backing up the games. To back up the games installed on the Switch, we'll use a homebrew application called DBI. First, connect your Switch to the computer using a USB Type-C cable. Then, open the album menu again to display the homebrew application menu. Launch the DBI application. Next, go to the configuration menu. Scroll down to the MTP Storages section. If the status of Installed Game is set to No, change it to Yes. Once that's done, return to the DBI main menu. Now, select Run MTP Responder. Let's move to the computer. Windows Explorer will automatically open with a media drive labeled Switch, containing several drives. To back up the games installed on the Switch, open drive number 4, Installed Games. Inside, you'll find folders named after the games and some files outside the folders. What you need to back up are the folders named after the games. These folders typically contain two files, the base game and the updates. If the game has DLCs installed, those files will also be included in the folder. Copy the game folders you want to back up, whether all of them or just specific ones. In my case, I'll back up only 4 games. Once that's done, we'll copy the save game backup files from earlier. To do this, go back to the root of the media drive. Then, open drive number 1, SD card. The save game backup files are stored in the JKSV folder. Just copy this JKSV folder to your computer. Alright, the game and save game backup process is complete. So, if the update fails and your Switch doesn't boot, you'll already have the important backup files you need to restore. Later, at the end of the tutorial, I'll show you how to restore the save games. The next step is to update the original Switch firmware and the custom firmware. First, let me show you the current firmware version on my Switch, which is 18.0. The custom firmware version is also 18.0, using Atmosphere 1.7.1. Now, let's proceed with the update. First, we'll download firmware version 19.0 and a custom firmware pack that includes Atmosphere 1.8, which supports firmware 19.0. Alright, let's start by downloading firmware 19.0. Here, I'm already on a website that provides Switch firmware archives. Let's download version 19.0. Next, we'll download the custom firmware pack. For this, I'll use the HATS custom firmware pack from Stedix, as I find it the most up-to-date. You can use your favorite custom firmware pack. Here, we can see the latest version is 1.8.0 v 1.3. As explained, it supports up to firmware version 19.0.1. You can also check out what's included in this custom firmware pack: homebrew applications, payloads, scripts, and other supporting files. Alright, let's click here to download. Okay, the firmware and custom firmware downloads are complete. Next, we extract the compressed files for both the firmware and the custom firmware pack. After extracting, we delete the compressed files, as they are no longer needed. Now, we'll copy the firmware and custom firmware pack files to the SD card. But before that, let's go back to the Switch. I forgot to mention earlier, if you're using a custom theme, you need to uninstall it before updating. Since my Switch has a custom theme, I'll uninstall it first. To do this, open the NX Themes Installer app. Select Uninstall Theme, then choose Uninstall Everything. After that, reboot your Switch. Once the Switch has restarted, turn it off, remove the SD card, and connect it to your computer. Alright, now let's copy the custom firmware pack to the root folder of the SD card. Note that if you're using a different custom firmware pack than the one you're copying now, you must delete the Atmosphere, bootloader, and config folders first. Also, delete the sept folder if it exists. Now, let's copy the custom firmware pack to the SD card. When this window pops up, select Replace the files. Okay, that's done. Next, copy the firmware 19.0 folder. This folder can be deleted after the update process is complete. Alright, the copying process for the firmware and custom firmware pack is complete. Next, eject the SD card and insert it back into the Switch. Now, turn on the Switch. You can see it boots into Hecate. Set the date and time if necessary. Here, I'll just skip that step. Select OK. As you can see, Hecate is now updated to version 6.2.2. Next, choose Launch. We will start updating the firmware for both the original Switch firmware running on SysNAND and the firmware running on EmuNAND. Let's start with the firmware on SysNAND. To do this, select SysMMC. In other custom firmware packs, this option might be named SysNAND. Wait for the Switch to finish booting. Once it's booted, open the album to display the homebrew menu. In some custom firmware packs, you may need to press and hold R before selecting album to access the homebrew menu. Next, choose Daybreak, and then select Install. Locate the firmware folder we copied earlier and select it. Wait for the validation process to complete, then choose Continue. After that, select all the options on the right. Make sure not to select the wrong ones. Choose Preserve Settings, then install FAT32 plus exFAT. Finally, choose Continue to begin the firmware update process. Wait until it's complete. Once done, select Reboot. Now, boot the Switch again via SysMMC. Check the firmware version in the Settings menu under System. You'll see that the firmware has been updated to version 19.0 and Atmosphere to version 1.8.0. Note that when we update the firmware through SysMMC, the original firmware is also updated automatically. We'll check the original firmware version shortly. Alright, now let's update the firmware running on EmuMMC. Restart your switch and boot it via EmuMMC this time. The update process is the same as before. Use the Daybreak app in the Homebrew menu. Once again, make sure to select all the options on the right to avoid any mistakes. Once the update process is complete, restart the switch. Let's check the firmware and atmosphere versions running on EmuMMC. As you can see, just like with SysMMC, the firmware has been updated to version 19.0 and atmosphere to version 1.9.0. The update process for both SysMMC and EmuMMC firmware was successful. Now, let's verify the original switch firmware. Restart the switch again, but this time boot into the original firmware. Next, open System Settings, then go to System. As you can see, the original firmware has been updated to version 19.0. This is because we updated it earlier through SysMMC. At this point, we've successfully updated the firmware, atmosphere, Hecate, and other components. Now, you can reinstall the custom theme you previously uninstalled. Open the XT Themes Installer app. Don't forget to check for updates, as we've just updated the firmware. Then, install your theme and reboot the system. Now, the theme has been successfully reapplied without any issues. Alright, at this point, we can conclude that the firmware update was successful. But what if the process fails and causes the switch to no longer boot normally? One of the solutions is to completely set up the SD card for custom firmware from scratch. You can find the tutorial for that here. However, resetting the SD card means you'll lose all the data on it, including save games and the games themselves. That's precisely why we created a backup earlier, so we can restore the save games and games after setting up the SD card for the Switch's custom firmware. At this stage, I'll demonstrate how to restore save games, but this assumes you've already reinstalled the games. I won't cover how to install games on custom firmware here, since I'm sure you're already familiar with that process. Now, let's move on to restoring save games. Here, I'll demonstrate the process using the game Sea of Stars. First, let's launch the game. I'll show you that there's currently no save data for this game. As you can see, the menu only displays New Game and Options. Alright, now let's restore the save game we backed up earlier, which includes the save data for Sea of Stars. To do this, remove the SD card from the Switch and insert it into your computer. Then, copy the JKSV folder containing the backup save game files back to the root directory of the SD card. Make sure to place it in the correct location. Don't get it wrong. If this window appears, choose Replace the Files. Once the copying process is complete, eject the SD card and reinsert it into the Switch. Then, boot the Switch via EmuMMC. Before restoring, you need to run the game at least once, even if it's just to the main screen, and then exit the game. Now, let's restore the save game we just copied to the SD card. Go to the Homebrew menu and launch the JKSV application. Next, select your profile picture. Then choose the game Sea of Stars. Under New Backup, you'll see the backup file we copied earlier. Highlight the name of the backup file. Press Y to restore the save game. Then press A to confirm. Alright, the restoration process is complete. Now, let's try launching the game again. As you can see, there are now 3 characters near a campfire. The main menu has also updated to include a load game option. When we open it, we can see several save game options available to load. Alright, the save game restoration process was successful. Alright, that's it for this tutorial on updating the custom firmware and the original firmware for the Nintendo Switch while ensuring all your important data is backed up and safe. I hope this guide was helpful and made the update process easier for you. If you found this video useful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, leave a comment if you have any questions, and subscribe to the channel for more tutorials like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.